eminently qualified to address the third issue that Laura raised, which is national ownership. What are the countries, how the recipient countries, how are they looking at this? What is their perspective? He's been involved in South Africa in an evaluation of South Africa itself on the contribution of the UN system to South Africa. And he's furthermore, of course, as he's another spider in the web, actually, the second spider, this time in the UN system. The UN system is also undertaking systematic evaluations of what they are contributing to development in a country. And these systematic evaluations are, UNDP plays an important role in them, helps establishing the framework for cooperation with the country. And so Indran has this, both the perspective from South Africa and the perspective of the UN on how these comprehensive evaluations potentially match, or whether we can draw lessons from them for the other effort to basically understand the international architecture from the country's perspective. So Indran, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rob, from the other spider, the web. Just very briefly to describe the UN evaluation architecture. To note that it rests on a policy and practice of multilateralism and promotes country ownership. So if one were to put that in practice, there's certain things that flow. As far as the normative work goes, we have our oversight body, which is the United Nations Evaluation Group, which provides guidance to the 45 agencies. And the whole idea is to share practice, to support each other, but also to recognize that within UNEG, this varies. Some of the agencies are independent, some have more capacity than others. To note that the largest of the evaluation agencies within the UN is the United Nations Development Programme Evaluation Office. And it has an evaluation policy that guarantees its independence, and it's very clear that UNDP evaluations should be board initiated. So the board stipulates right up front over a 3-year period which evaluations it wants, that is the client, and it has not seen until now a need to commission independent comprehensive evaluations. It respects and is quite fine with the quality of evaluations that it receives to inform the various programs of the UNDP. But moving to the country level, which is where the action is, we are talking about 165 countries, and where the assessment of development results, which is really the country level evaluation, comes in, it is to an extent comprehensive. It's comprehensive in that it looks at the entire operation of the UN in a country. So it's an evaluation that is taken very seriously. Increasingly we use national consultants. There is an independent board to ensure that the credibility, the validity, there's a long consultation process. But these evaluations have high utility because the moment they are completed, it informs the program for the next country, the next country program for the various countries. And this year alone, I've been involved in 6 of the presentations across the globe, from UAE to Liberia to Sri Lanka. And of course, the experience has been varied. But generally, there's a high respect that the evaluations are independent. We find that the more independent and the more critical we are of the UNDP office, the happier the government becomes. And they say it is very independent. And of course, then we have the pressure that actually comes from the UNDP country offices. But the independence part is clearly established. So we are also beginning to see, in some instances, at the country level, demand for other evaluations outside the evaluations that are commissioned through the board architecture. Now, you cannot prevent that because donors operate at various levels. And that could be interpreted in different ways. One, it could complement the assessment of development results and all the other evaluations that take place. But there is another interpretation where perhaps the donor community does not see the evaluations that are being conducted by UN agencies as critical enough, and therefore decides to commission its own evaluation. Thus far, we've been managing to keep it at bay, to say, work through us, let's see how we can work in partnership. And it goes back to my opening point that in the context of multilateralism and the whole commitment to country ownership, and that there is a commitment to develop the evaluation capacity within the UN, there is still a respect for that structure. But this does not mean that there is no place for comprehensive evaluations, because even an assessment of even a country level evaluation, whilst it takes place over the 6-month period and looks at a country in total, will never be able to answer all the questions, and there's still a whole lot of fragmentation, and the multiple agencies, both UN, multilaterals, etc., that operate, and can never give a full picture of what is happening. But it's a matter that I will take, and we will take, to UNEP and look at the guidance and see to what extent we can use that to infuse into the evaluation units within the UN. And on the basis of that, prepare for a time that is going to come, as Berg has indicated, when the funds go down and there's a greater accountability demand on that. So in the country level evaluation, we try to straddle accountability, learning, and transparency. We shift on that range. There's a greater command, a greater request from the board for accountability. What goes wrong? It does not mean you cannot have learning, but that obviously puts an evaluation unit, irrespective of how well resourced or independent, under a tremendous amount of pressure. And just from the UNDP Evaluation Office perspective, I'm in the process of setting up further independent panels that will advise me at the headquarter level, but that will also support the decentralized evaluation across the 5 regions, because we can't decentralize to nothing. You must also put in place a certain level of capacity so that you can have a greater amount of coherence at that level. Thank you.
Well, thanks very much. And let me end with some notes before we open the floor for discussion. It's very interesting that the panel, as you have heard, it is not advocating for comprehensive evaluations. In fact, several panel members said, these are disruptive to the organizations. They should not, they are too expensive. They are not based on solid evaluative evidence often. The methodology is often not the correct one, etc., etc. Nevertheless, there is a need to learn from these experiences to integrate them back into the evaluation streams. We've actually done this in the Global Environment Facility. The reason why I was able to reduce the budget for the 5th overall performance study with 1 million was because we integrated issues, especially the country level issues, which cannot be answered in these comprehensive evaluations, into our country evaluations. This was a major part of the reduction in funding. But if we do this, we actually should learn from what has happened, and we should not let this mountain of evidence that we've gathered in more than 17 evaluations that cost overall more than $30 million. We should not just let that lay on the wayside and say, okay, this is no longer important. There are pointers that were given where we could potentially do this. Caroline mentioned that the source book could be, when it's updated, there could be some possibility to include some of the evidence. Indran raised the issue. We can discuss this further in the UN evaluation group, especially on the linkage with the country level perspective. And so there are possibilities. And then we have this comprehensive evaluations initiative for knowledge exchange, which would be a platform for the community of practice. So is this the way forward? And what would your questions and recommendations be? David, you wanted to... And I noticed that also.
Thank you. David Ryder-Smith. 2 questions. One is, what is comprehensive? What do you mean by it? Are we talking about organizational level evaluation, or does it potentially include a much broader range of large-scale, complex evaluations? So, for example, could we include country level evaluations of national development plans at country levels? Could we look at complex systems like in the UK, where you have the Independent Commission for Aid Impact, which has been set up, which reports directly to Parliament on a global scale, taking particular thematic issues that then DFID has to respond to. So what is comprehensive and how inclusive can it be? That's question 1. Second question is around, demand and clarifying the demand issue that Bob raised. So I wondered, Indran mentioned that they have to respond UNDP to the board, but I want to know how coherent the board is in the case of UNDP in terms of defining its demand, what it wants to evaluate, what it doesn't, and at the country level, is there sufficient incentive for country governments to engage in the evaluations of agencies? In the case of Uganda, that I know there are over 50 official development agencies present. The government, frankly, I don't think is interested in participating in 50 separate evaluations. So I want to know what the incentives would be.
Ted, could you?
Thanks. Just a quick question.
Introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry. My name is Ted Klees, the Evaluation Department in the Ministry for Affairs in the Netherlands. And I have a remark on the observation of Rob that apparently the panel is not very much willing to pursue the comprehensive evaluation as such. I heard otherwise. For instance, Derek mentioned the UNCDF evaluation, which I happen to be the task manager for. So UNCDF didn't have an evaluation function to do its own comprehensive evaluation. That's why we went external, and the donors wanted to have an evaluation to replenish. Caroline was saying, yes, comprehensive evaluations are important, but not necessarily donor instigated. Evaluation departments, if they're well grounded in the organization, as mentioned by Indran, independent, credible, and producing good evaluation reports, then I think the place for comprehensive evaluations should be those evaluation departments. Now, of course, you can learn from the previous evaluations to improve the evaluations, as mentioned by Elliot, for instance, and Bob. But that's a different matter to institute, let's say, a kind of new instrument where it sits. Is not very clear to me now from the presentations. I'd rather see it sitting in the evaluation departments if they are credible and independent enough. Thanks.
Fabrizio?
Thank you very much. Fabrizio Felloni from IFAD, Independent Evaluation Office. I think actually I have a few sort of disorganized thoughts. Sorry for the disorganization, but first of all, I think the panel has been rightly so prudent in approaching the theme. I didn't think they advocated against. I think they were prudent, rightly so. I think, if I may, I think there's a good reason to advocate for, again, with some prudence and cautions for this type of comprehensive evaluation. Consider that if you conduct a series or a summation of country-level evaluation, you're going to run into a lot of systemic issues which are going to pop up in all evaluations. And findings will depend on a certain number of systemic issues in the organization, which a country-level, lower-level evaluation will not have the scope, the profile, and perhaps the audience to tackle. So that's a big important value added. Second point is, I also think having guidelines is important, and perhaps what is most important is to start focusing on the negative cases, on the sort of failures. Why did they fail? I would actually look at those ones first. And then the other 2 points are, the other issue which is still valid is the spacing between two exercises. They consume a lot of energy. The organization needs time to respond to this system, because sometimes findings might be devastating, or sometimes just very strong. And the last point is that, true, many of these comprehensive evaluations have been linked to the refinancing cycle of the organization. But there are also cases, perhaps, where this evaluation the scope can come from from the bottom and be nurtured. For example, with a recent case in our organization, IFAD, we are conducting an evaluation on efficiency of IFAD, which I think would be within this definition. And it doesn't come from a request from donors. It doesn't come from a refinancing need. It comes from evidence collected for our own evaluation through the synthesis, and we were able to advocate for it because it was a substantive basis, solid evidence that efficiency was an issue at the program institutional level, and then it could be accepted that this exercise was important. Sorry for being long.
No, these were excellent points. And before we go into a second round, yes, I've noticed you. I have one here as well. Before we go into a second round, indeed, some quick answers, and over to the panel. Comprehensive evaluations can be on anything, of course. But we are talking here about the comprehensive evaluations of the achievements and performance of international institutions. So this is it's the group that is defining what these are. And as Fabrizio pointed out, these are the only evaluations that really look at the institutional level. Many of our evaluations are at the program level, policy level, strategy level, performance level, and they go to the country level. And then, of course, we get these comprehensive evaluations from the country perspective. So, but these are the only ones that look at it from the institutional level. So let me then turn for the other issues to the panel. And since you notice that I don't keep track of anything that's being said, I have no pen in hand, I count on you to help me to, that we indeed do address all the questions. Who would like to have the floor first? Bob, would you want to?
I would like to suggest that what we have in this comprehensive evaluation essentially meet a different objectives in different mixes. But as Rob just said, we are talking here about evaluation of multilateral institutions. Now, on the one hand, you have the United Nations, which has a normative role and limited, really, resources to transfer. I mean, so many people will argue that many UN agencies are not aid agencies, really. They have a different role, human rights, and setting rules of the game, and peace, and so forth. So I think we have a very, the population is very varied. But the donors, the donors are the ones who are basically the client of the existing organization. And post-Busan, I was arguing that it shouldn't be only the donors, but the development community more generally, and have a real conversation between donors and recipients. Now, one thing donors want is whether or not their replenishment conditions have been met or not, a purely summative thing. And that's what I meant by subverting, because very often, I know in the case of the Heider replenishment, our evaluation questioned whether the matrix which was put on Heider was in fact, and some of the governors were quite upset that we're questioning the goals of the replenishment, but that was the proof of our independence. But other donors, including Nordics, by the way, supported us. So one thing is purely summative from a donor perspective. The second one is a comparative assessment. And this group has decided to cover this as well, because they with limited budget, they want to know where to put the money. And for that, you do need comparability. And then you have the third group, which is formative, that's what Elliot was talking about, which really help in strategy, help in change. So of course you could have evaluation which cover all these three things. So obviously to have guidelines for all these three things is tricky, but I think we need to think through how do we meet the needs of the whole development community. I mean, that's what I want. I just want to clarify what is it that we are looking at and how complex and comprehensive it is.
Thank you. Any others of the Indran?
Just on the term comprehensive, I think we need to, if you look at what is behind the topic of the evaluation that is commissioned within an institution, would indicate the extent to which there is confidence in the agency that conducts the evaluation on the corporate level. So for example, this year, increasingly topics that are coming through, the UNDP evaluation of elections, big topic, global. Evaluation of global and philanthropic funds. The UNDP in conflict, moving forward. UNDP of the evaluation of the strategic plan. Evaluation of global and regional programs. And these tend to be extremely comprehensive. So a good evaluation function, irrespective of where it resides, needs to be able to operate at multiple levels, global as well as country. And that means different methodologies, different modalities in terms of how it works. We're not saying there should not be comprehensive evaluation, but what we can learn from comprehensive evaluations is that you can draw that down into the existing evaluation architecture to bolster it. So we will not have hopefully we will not reach a point where it gets initiated outside and then you have no control of what really happens.
Thank you. Elliot.
Just to make a connection between what we're talking about here, and another theme that has run through many parts of the conference. I think we talked a lot about complexity and complexity in evaluation during this conference. I think that, from my point of view, comprehensive is approaching this issue of complexity in quite a practical way. You have to look at these entities as being an interrelationship between a mandate, a strategy, a governance process, activities, decentralized activities, delivery processes, relationships across the boundary between the organization itself and other, let's say, UN agencies or other agencies that you have to cooperate with countries, with multiple activities taking place in those countries. So I think that, for me, the core of the comprehensive argument is looking at the interdependence between parts of an organization rather than focusing, let's say, just on what's happening in a particular country or just on what is happening in a particular management unit. The second thing that I wanted to say is I think we need to take a more nuanced view of independence. I would say, in retrospect, and I may have felt differently at the time, but I would say in retrospect, I've always been impressed by the independent role of the evaluation functions, but that didn't always mean that they could necessarily do it themselves. You could take the view that the fact that you need to get external people to do a major evaluation is a sign of a deficit in the internal capabilities and role of an evaluation function. Or you could take the view that the role of the evaluation function is to mediate between an external contracting organization and the internal, and it protects the independence by drawing up proper terms of reference and then putting work out to tender. Because in many evaluation systems, you don't have an internal evaluation capability as you may have, let's say, in the bank and in some other agencies. It's mainly a contract management system which puts out the work to other people. So I think in that context, the notion of independence has to be understood in a slightly different way than it would be in a different setting.
Okay, thank you very much. Let's go for a second round. I have 3 people.
I have the mic.
Too many, actually, but I cannot give the floor to everybody. So you over there in the red sweater. Do you have a microphone? Is there somebody with a microphone? Okay.
I have the microphone.
Oh, Frederick, you took the microphone, but
Thank you.
please introduce yourself.
Okay, my name is Mansur Ghazi. I'm at the University of Buffalo, State University of New York. And I'd like to thank the panel for the excellent contribution, and what they're doing is exactly how I would do the comprehensive evaluations. But I would respectfully suggest that there's one missing element here. I am doing a comprehensive evaluation of one of the 55 counties in New York State. And by that we mean that we have individual level data on every single child in the school, from all the school districts and every market year. Then we have full data from all the agencies working with children in the county. And then we look at what happens before they receive the service, what happens after they receive the service. We compare those receiving particular services with those that are not. That's what I mean by comprehensive evaluation. So I respectfully suggest that what you should do, like organizations like the World Bank, is use universal data that already exists. For example, gross domestic product, health services, education services, before the intervention and after the intervention. And you can use methods drawn from epidemiology, not effectiveness research, because we're looking at large data sets. Use the methodology that was used to prove that smoking causes cancer. There was no randomized controlled trial, but you had natural comparison groups emerging from the data. So that's why I would respectfully suggest you go one step further. Up to now, all you talked about is actually formative evaluation, not summative evaluation. That's good. You need to know what the programs are, how the programs are delivered, but we need to know what the impact of the programs is. And I respectfully suggest to you that most of the data is already there. Want to use the data that already exists. And yes, there may be limitations in the data, but once you start using that data, the countries will be more aware of how to deal with those limitations.
Okay, thank you very much. It's a very useful suggestion. Nancy, you want to?
Yes, thank you. Nancy McPherson with the Rockefeller Foundation. I want to congratulate this whole initiative for elevating the importance of institutional assessment and organizational performance, along with the impact of the work. Because I think we all know that good organizational performance is more than the sum of the parts. It's more than what they do out there. It's about the way we lead, its vision, its management, its staff satisfaction, its beneficiary feedback. So I wonder if you would unpack a little bit how far you've been able to get. I know that you all know organizational assessment frameworks, but have you been able to get structured satisfaction and perception feedback from staff, from beneficiaries? Have you been able to include all of that vision and leadership in the kind of assessment? I know that's enormously hard to do in a political environment, but it's hugely important. And then if you would, just from your really good experience in this field, what are the top 3 things that you have seen that would exemplify a well-performing organization?
Thanks very much. I have only one more question that I can allow due to time restraints. Mark.
Right, short. Marcus Palmberg, Institute for Development Strategy. I'm on a technical advisory panel that actually produces this source book, updated source book Caroline was mentioning. We've done a number of global and regional partnership program evaluations myself. So I've been thinking about things, and I think I wanted to stress one point and also invite the panel to comment on that. A point that Nancy, Bob, and Derek have mentioned, which is the additional evaluation of organizational performance, which is additional to most other evaluation types. And that poses some interesting questions I'm always struggling with myself when doing this evaluation. So on the one hand, you have the team, you have the McKinsey-style people taking care of that part of the organization, of the organizational performance assessment, and then you have the regular evaluators doing the kind of development performance, development effectiveness work. And so in a way that's nicely separated. But then you cannot separate these 2 parts. That's also one reason why they're both in that topic. Because take an example of calculating institutional overheads. I've seen that with the CGIAR, but also with other organizations. High institutional overheads are considered bad. But they might be totally justified if they're driven by excellent project preparation and supervision. So I just wanted to kind of ask the panel on how to manage actually that you have so different skills needed, but still have to knit somehow these 2 parts together.
Okay, so sorry we cannot have more questions, so Frederick and Laura will all have lunch with you and continue talking to you. Could I ask the panel to basically answer these questions, but also make a closing statement? Caroline, maybe you want to start and you just go through the chat.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I want to tap into what Ted was saying earlier on in his question, namely that it is not a matter of saying comprehensive evaluation is not that what we want to support, but more thinking about how do we institutionalize evaluation so that we generate all the evidence that we need, that if we want to then make a comprehensive assessment at whichever frequency we choose, that we can do this building onto the evaluation evidence that exists already and then add in components that look at organizational effectiveness and then issues that cut across and are more systemic that one wouldn't see on an individual evaluation. So that was sort of more the plea for thinking about comprehensive evaluation slightly differently from the ones that are in the limelight, the 17 that have cost whatever how many millions of dollars, which were very much ad hoc and which were very diverse. As Elliot was saying, that there were very different drivers behind them. There were different questions that needed to be answered. And so we in IEG are dealing more with the regular ones that are being done on the GRPP. So I think the thinking of the evaluation community has to differentiate between these different ones in order to come up with a system that is comprehensive to deliver evaluations.
A comprehensive